A nation that mistakes a ceasefire for a settlement does not become more secure. It becomes more surprised when the war resumes. What you are watching unfold between Washington and Tehran in the spring of 2026 is not a peace process. It is a power adjustment, temporary, unstable, and already misread by nearly every commentator who has weighed in on it. The United States struck Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. A conditional ceasefire was brokered, extended, re-extended, and is now wrapped in a 60-day memorandum of understanding that neither side has fully signed, neither side fully accepts, and neither side expects to hold without further coercion. And yet, the dominant narrative in every capital from Washington to London to Riyadh is that a deal is within reach, that diplomacy is working, that the patient application of pressure has brought a rogue state to the table. The historical record has seen this before, and the historical record is not optimistic. By the end of this video, you will understand why the question, will the US and Iran reach a deal, is the wrong question entirely. And once you understand what the right question is, it will permanently change how you read every foreign policy crisis that follows this one. The right question is not whether an agreement will be signed. Agreements are signed every decade in this region. The right question is whether the underlying structure of power between these two states has changed in a way that makes a durable settlement possible. That is a different inquiry. It requires different tools, and it produces a very different answer than what you will find in the morning briefing or the evening broadcast. Hold that question. We will return to it precisely, but not yet. Let us first establish what is actually at stake, because the stakes are consistently misrepresented in ways that serve political rhetoric rather than strategic clarity. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a geographic feature. It is the single most consequential choke point in the global energy architecture. Roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes through it. When Iran closed the strait at the onset of this conflict, it was not performing an act of desperation. It was deploying the one asymmetric instrument available to a regionally powerful state facing a technologically superior adversary. The closure was a message written in the language that great powers actually understand, the language of material cost. Iran discovered that the geography it sits upon is a more effective bargaining instrument than any missile it has ever manufactured. This is the first thing that realist analysis reveals which idealist analysis conceals. Power is not only military, it is also positional, economic, and geographic. A state with no aircraft carriers but a coastline along the world's most critical waterway holds a form of power that no amount of superior firepower can simply bomb away. You can destroy enrichment centrifuges, you can crater missile production facilities, you cannot relocate the Strait of Hormuz, and yet the framing in Washington continues to speak as though American military action has fundamentally altered the Iranian position. It has not. It has altered the cost Iran must pay to maintain that position. That is a meaningful distinction, and collapsing it is how great powers make expensive mistakes. Here is what the data actually shows. As of late May 2026, US and Iranian negotiators reached agreement on a 60-day memorandum of understanding to extend the ceasefire and begin formal negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. The most critical issues, the fate of Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, the question of whether Iran retains any domestic enrichment capacity, the status of Fordow, the ballistic missile program remain entirely unresolved. The memorandum, according to reporting from both Axios and PBS NewsHour, contains an Iranian commitment not to pursue a nuclear weapon. That commitment, as one senior analyst at the Eurasia Group correctly observed, is not new. Iranian leadership has stated for years that it does not seek a nuclear weapon. Obtaining a restatement of an existing position and presenting it as a diplomatic breakthrough is not statecraft, it is theater. Now ask yourself this, who benefits from the theater? The United States benefits from the appearance of diplomatic progress because the domestic political costs of a sustained military campaign are rising. Iran benefits from the appearance of negotiation because 60 days of no additional strikes allows partial reconstruction of damaged infrastructure and critically allows time for the Fordow enrichment facility, which survived both the June 2025 and February 2026 strikes because it sits beneath 80 meters of granite that no conventional munition in the American inventory can penetrate to continue operating. The ceasefire, in structural terms, advantages the party with greater patience and a longer time horizon. Historically, that has not been Washington. This is where the first principle of classical realism applies with full force. In politics among nations, I argued that statesmen must think in terms of interest defined as power, not in terms of the moral categories that domestic politics demands. A president who needs to demonstrate results before a midterm cycle operates under a time constraint that the Iranian state, which does not face electoral accountability in the same form, does not share. Trump himself acknowledged this when he said he does not care about the midterms, but the institutional pressures of American democracy do not disappear because a president declares them irrelevant. The American system produces impatience. The Iranian system, for all its internal dysfunction, produces a different calculus of time. Bismarck understood this asymmetry when dealing with France after 1871. He knew that France would eventually recover its strength and seek revision of the settlement. He structured German foreign policy around managing that timeline, not pretending the timeline did not exist. The question for Washington is not whether it can force Iran to sign a document in June of 2026. The question is whether any document signed in June of 2026 can survive the structural pressures of 2027, 2028 and beyond. And on that question, the historical record of agreements in this region speaks with uncomfortable clarity. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Obama-era nuclear deal, was not a failure of intent, it was a failure of structural design. It secured Iranian compliance with enrichment limits for a defined period in exchange for sanctions relief. What it did not do was alter the underlying strategic incentive that drives Iranian nuclear ambition in the first place. The awareness that a nuclear deterrent is the one instrument that permanently removes regime change as a credible threat. Libya surrendered its nuclear program in 2003 and was destroyed by NATO airstrikes in 2011. North Korea maintained its nuclear program and has not been touched. The lesson that any rational Iranian strategist draws from this comparison is not subtle, and no amount of sanctions, pressure, military strikes, or diplomatic creativity changes the fundamental logic of that lesson unless the underlying security guarantee offered to Iran is of a kind that Washington has never shown willingness to provide. This is the curiosity gap that every analysis of the Iran deal refuses to enter. If Iran's nuclear program is driven by a rational security calculation, then the only durable solution is a security arrangement that addresses that calculation. But addressing that calculation requires acknowledging that Iran has legitimate security interests, and that acknowledgement is politically impossible in Washington, where the domestic narrative about Iran has been constructed over 4 decades in ways that preclude the language of legitimate interest. This is what I described in Defense of the National Interest as the danger of ideological foreign policy. When a state cannot speak honestly about the interests of its adversary, it cannot design a policy that actually addresses those interests, and it is therefore condemned to repeat the cycle of pressure, partial agreement, collapse, and renewed pressure indefinitely. Consider what the current demand structure actually looks like. Washington insists on zero domestic enrichment, surrender of the highly enriched uranium stockpile, dismantlement of the Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan sites, an end to Iranian support for Hezbollah and Hamas, and freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran's counterposition demands recognition of its sovereign right to enrich, full sanctions relief, security guarantees against future military action, and war reparations. These are not positions separated by a gap that skilled diplomats can bridge with creative language. They are positions rooted in incompatible strategic logics. Washington seeks an Iran militarily neutered and stripped of its primary regional deterrent. Tehran seeks recognition as a legitimate regional power. No 60-day memorandum resolves this. The history of the 20th century is littered with agreements signed between parties whose underlying interests remained irreconcilable. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was celebrated as a triumph of rational arms control. 10 years later, Japan was building in secret. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 won their architects the Nobel Peace Prize. 14 years later, those borders were being redrawn by force. The pattern is precise. Agreements that do not address the structural sources of conflict do not prevent conflict. They postpone it at considerable cost to the party that believes the paper more completely. Ask yourself this: What structural source of US-Iran conflict does the current memorandum of understanding address? The answer is the immediate operational problem of the Strait of Hormuz closure, which was costing the global economy and therefore costing the United States diplomatically and economically in ways that made continued military pressure politically unsustainable. This is a legitimate interest to address. Reopening the strait is a concrete, verifiable, immediately measurable outcome. On this single point, the logic of the agreement is sound. The error, and it is a significant one, is in presenting the reopening of a waterway as equivalent to, or a step toward, resolution of a 40-year strategic confrontation of a nuclear capacity, regional influence, and regime security. These are categorically different problems operating on categorically different timelines, and treating them as a single negotiating package produces exactly the confusion that now characterizes every public discussion of what a deal with Iran would actually mean. Now we arrive at the deepest structural problem in this negotiation, the one that almost no commentator names directly. Iran's nuclear program did not emerge from irrational aggression or ideological extremism. It emerged from a specific strategic environment that any state in Iran's position would have navigated similarly, surrounded by states with American military bases, neighbor to a nuclear-armed Israel that has repeatedly demonstrated willingness to conduct preemptive strikes on Iranian infrastructure, subject to the most extensive unilateral sanctions regime ever imposed on a nation outside of wartime. Having watched the United States overthrow a neighboring government in 2003 that it did not like, and having heard American officials describe regime change as a legitimate policy objective for Tehran, in this environment, the pursuit of nuclear deterrence is not irrational. It is, by any straightforward application of the logic of power politics, the entirely predictable behavior of a state that has correctly identified the one instrument that changes its strategic calculus from prey to deterrent. This does not mean the United States should accept Iranian nuclear weapons capability. It means that any policy designed to prevent that capability must grapple with security environments that produces the incentive for it. Sanctions alone do not change that environment. Military strikes that cannot reach Fordow do not change that environment. A 60-day memorandum of understanding that does not include IAEA access provisions, no enrichment freeze clause, no verification mechanism for the 2-week window, which is precisely what the current agreement lacks, does not change that environment. The balance of power in the Middle East has been destabilized not by Iranian aggression in isolation, but by the sequential failures of American policy to think in terms of regional equilibrium rather than regional transformation. The invasion of Iraq destroyed the primary Arab counterweight to Iranian regional influence. The Libya intervention demonstrated that security guarantees offered to states that surrender WMD programs are not reliable. The withdrawal from the 2015 agreement in 2018 demonstrated that multilateral agreements involving the United States carry the counterparty risk of being dissolved by the next administration. Each of these decisions, defended with the language of moral clarity and national security, collectively produced a regional landscape that is structurally more dangerous than the one that existed before any of them were made. This is what I mean when I say that ideological foreign policy is the most dangerous form of political self-deception available to a great power. The United States did not pursue these policies because its leaders were foolish or malicious. They pursued them because the domestic political framework within which American foreign policy is formulated makes it extremely difficult to speak honestly about the interests of adversaries, the limits of military power, or the strategic value of equilibrium over transformation. Woodrow Wilson was not a fool. The architects of the Iraq War were not stupid men. They were intelligent people operating within an ideological framework that systematically distorted their perception of what power could accomplish. The same distortion is operating now. Let us turn to the Israeli dimension, because any analysis of this negotiation that treats it as a bilateral US-Iran affair is analytically incomplete. Israel's strategic objectives in this confrontation are not identical to American strategic objectives, and the divergence between them is not a minor operational detail. It is a structural feature of the negotiating environment that shapes what outcomes are actually achievable. Israel's demand is total, zero enrichment, removal of all fissile material, verifiable dismantlement of the nuclear infrastructure, destruction of delivery systems. This is not a negotiating position. It is a statement of maximal preference that serves as a veto over any agreement that falls short of it. And the current memorandum of understanding falls dramatically short of it. Israel reportedly believes the current ceasefire is premature and wants at least another month of additional military operations. Netanyahu has been applying pressure on Trump to reject any deal that eases pressure on Iran. Trump, who has appeared optimistic about an agreement on multiple prior occasions before reversing course, is now described as seeking assurance that any deal can be presented as stronger than the 2015 Obama-era agreement, which is a domestic political constraint masquerading as a strategic requirement. Three actors, three incompatible definitions of acceptable outcome, one negotiating table. The concert of Europe, which maintained great power peace for nearly 4 decades after 1815, succeeded precisely because it was constructed around the recognition that all major powers had a stake in the stability of the system, and that the system's rules had to reflect that shared stake rather than the maximalist preferences of any single participant. The settlement at Vienna worked because Metternich and Castlereagh, and even Talleyrand, representing defeated France, understood that a settlement which humiliated or existentially threatens any major power would eventually be overturned by that power, and that the cost of revision would fall on everyone. The Congress system asked each power to accept less than its maximum preference in exchange for a stable order from which all could benefit. That is what durable diplomacy looks like in practice. It does not look like one party demanding unconditional surrender while another demands sovereign recognition of the very capacity the first party is trying to eliminate. The prudent statesman, and prudence, as I have argued throughout my work, is the supreme political virtue, does not ask what outcome is morally most satisfying. The prudent statesman asks what outcome is structurally stable, and Iran stripped of all nuclear capacity by force, if such a thing were achievable, creates a power vacuum in the region that would be filled by other actors in ways that may not serve American interests. An Iran that signs a document committing to something it has no intention of implementing, because no verification mechanism has been constructed that would make violation costly, creates the illusion of security while the underlying dynamics proceed unchanged. Neither of these is a durable outcome. The durable outcome, the one that a Bismarckian statecraft would be designing for, is an Iran that is integrated into a regional security architecture in which it bears real costs for destabilizing behavior and derives real benefits from constructive participation. That architecture does not exist, and no 60-day memorandum creates it. Now let us steelman the strongest objection to the realist position, because intellectual honesty demands it, and because the objection is not trivial. The liberal internationalist case for the current negotiations runs as follows. Half a loaf is better than no loaf. Even an imperfect agreement that pauses the most dangerous dynamics for 60 days creates space for further diplomacy, builds institutional habits of communication, reduces the risk of miscalculation, and may evolve over time into something more durable. The 1972 Shanghai Communiqué between Nixon and Mao was not a comprehensive settlement of US-China differences. It was a framework for managed coexistence that served both parties' interests for decades. Perhaps the current Iran memorandum is a Shanghai Communiqué in embryo, the beginning of a process, not the end of one. This is a serious argument, and it deserves a serious response. The Shanghai Communiqué worked because it was rooted in a genuine convergence of interest between two parties who each faced a common strategic threat, Soviet power, and whose cooperation in managing that threat was more valuable to each than their ideological differences were damaging. The structural conditions for that convergence existed before the diplomacy formalized them. Nixon and Kissinger did not create the shared interest in containing Soviet expansion. They recognized it and built a framework around it. The framework succeeded because the underlying interest alignment was real. What is the structural convergence of interest between Washington and Tehran today? On the narrow question of preventing immediate escalation, both sides share a preference. On every question beyond that regional, nuclear capacity, the future of Hezbollah and Hamas, Iranian sovereignty over strategic waterways, the architecture of Middle Eastern security, their interests are not convergent. They are opposed. Building a durable agreement on the foundation of a single shared preference for not fighting right now is not the Shanghai model, it is the Munich model. And the Munich model's problem was not that Chamberlain was a coward. The problem was that the structural convergence of interests that could have sustained the agreement did not exist. Germany's revisionist ambitions and Britain's status quo interests were not reconcilable by paper. They were reconcilable only by a change in the underlying power distribution, which is precisely what the agreement was supposed to prevent. A sound objection does not survive contact with history. It must survive contact with the specific structural conditions of the case to which it is applied. And in this case, the conditions that made the Shanghai Communiqué work are absent. We return now to the question planted at the opening of this analysis, the question that reframes everything. Not will the United States and Iran reach a deal, but has the underlying structure of power between these two states changed in a way that makes a durable settlement possible? The answer, examined through the lens of every analytical instrument that 6 decades of studying international politics has sharpened, is not yet, and possibly not soon. Here is what would have to be true for a durable settlement to emerge. Iran would have to conclude that the strategic value of nuclear deterrence is outweighed by the benefits of genuine international integration, which requires Washington to offer security guarantees it has never shown willingness to provide. The United States would have to accept Iranian regional influence as a structural feature of the Middle Eastern landscape that cannot be sanctioned or bombed away. And Israel would have to accept a settlement that leaves Iran with meaningful sovereignty over its own strategic decisions. All three conditions would have to materialize simultaneously because each depends on the others. This is not impossibility. History has produced more improbable structural transformations. The Franco-German reconciliation after 1945 was built between nations that had fought 3 wars in 70 years. It worked because the structural conditions, American security guarantees, the Soviet threat, economic interdependence, and leaders who understood the old logic was finished, aligned simultaneously. It required statesmanship of the highest order, but it also required structural preconditions that the statesmanship could build upon. Those preconditions do not yet exist in the American-Iranian case. The 60-day memorandum does not create them. What it does, and this is not nothing, is prevent the immediate situation from deteriorating into resumed strikes at a moment when neither side has achieved its objectives. In realist terms, this is rational for the current moment. As a foundation for a durable settlement, it is insufficient, and confusing the two is precisely how the next escalation is prepared while everyone is celebrating the current de-escalation. The American foreign policy tradition has struggled with this distinction since Wilson. The preference for universal principle over particular interest, for moral clarity over strategic ambiguity, for transformation over management, these are not weaknesses of character. They are features of the political culture that American democracy produces, but they are costly features when problems do not yield to moral clarity. Iran is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be managed. The difference between those two framings is the difference between a policy architecture that can be sustained and one that cycles endlessly between confrontation and collapsed agreement. Diplomacy, properly understood, is not the alternative to power. It is the continuation of power by other means. The diplomat's art is to use the leverage that power provides to construct arrangements that reflect the real distribution of interests and capabilities, not the idealized distribution that moral preference would produce. When that art is practiced well, as it was at Vienna in 1815, as it was in the Nixon-Kissinger opening to China, the results are durable because they are grounded in reality. When it is practiced poorly, when agreements serve the political needs of the moment rather than the structural requirements of stability, the results are Versailles, Munich, and every other case where paper was mistaken for power. The right question was never whether the United States and Iran will reach a deal. Deals are easy. Any two parties can sign a document. The right question, the one that changes how you read every crisis that follows this one, is whether the power structure that would make a deal whole has been constructed. And on that question, the honest answer, delivered without illusion and without despair, is not yet. Build the structure first. The agreement will follow. Reverse the order, and you will be back here in 3 years, older, more expensive, and no closer to the stability that the struggle for power and peace actually requires. Peace is not declared. It is constructed interest by interest, verification by verification, incentive by incentive, until the parties find it more costly to defect than to comply. Everything short of that is a ceasefire. And a ceasefire, as the 20th century demonstrated with remarkable consistency, is not the end of a conflict. It is the interval between its chapters.